yeah, that have come together, the sort of the thinking strands and the learning and the researching and the action researching strands have come together in different ways. But I'm talking about the bit that I'm aware of, and the work that I've been doing around this for about the last year or so, with lots of streams running into that from my whole life, really. And particularly in an article that Justin and I wrote called Trauma, Politics and Empathy, which was really a process of trying to unpick why we'd got into this mess around politics, both here in the UK and it seems pretty much everywhere in the world, and what we could do about it. And the article took a very long time to start because I kept on trying to start it and then I would end up talking about trauma. And I really, really didn't want to talk about trauma and politics in the same breath because it felt like a really scary thing to do. It felt like a very countercultural thing to do. And eventually on my third try, I just decided to go with it because I kept on, I was there again with trauma again. So I kind of wrote it out. And what I realized was that we have to talk about trauma. That is really fundamental to why we've got into the situation, both personally, but much more culturally and globally. And that the things that we tend to be worried about, the racism and sexism, inequality, climate change, a whole host of environmental issues and social issues, they're all symptoms, and what they're all symptoms of is a system of domination that has become pretty much globalized. It's a really traumatizing system to live in, and it has affected every area of our life, including our politics, the place where we make our collective decisions. And I first got interested in this because I found I got introduced to sociocracy and found that there were other ways of making decisions. There were straightforward, clear, inclusive, even enjoyable processes for making decisions about quite complex things that I had never realized was possible. But if we reel back a little bit just to unpick what I mean by trauma, I have a very broad definition. So it includes things like the PTSD and the kind of trauma that people come home to the UK from wars that they have persecuted on other people or the people who are in those places. But it's also can be stuff that happens in our childhood, and that can be very, very traumatic stuff, the trauma that happens through abuse. But actually young children are pattern makers. They're trying to make patterns of the world all the time. And they will often pattern in things that are upsetting that to an adult's eye might not look particularly traumatic, and yet they are. So a kind of an atmosphere in my house of people being unhappy, a feeling that I'm not okay because I got told off. All of those things get patterned in as trauma. And what makes them trauma really for me is that they often have a lot of unconscious. They live in our unconscious. And they're often activated by situations that remind us in some way of that original experience. So we come out with behaviors that really belong to a little child. But because we're unconscious, we don't even necessarily realize that we're being unreasonable or more frightened than you would expect or more angry than you would expect. So we have a lot of reactivity, reactions and responses that are out of proportion objectively to the situations that we're in. And those come from our deep patterning throughout our lives, and particularly in childhood. And it's something that we don't really talk about. We talk about it maybe in our close relationships, maybe in therapy, but we have in the kind of, certainly in the UK, and I think in most of the kind of developed world, we have almost no social processes for sharing and for healing that internal patterning. And when it comes to our power structures, what we see is that we have a ruling class who are deliberately traumatized as they grow up. There's a whole kind of pattern of upper class child rearing, which has got to do with deliberately damaging young children's sense of empathy. And that's done, I think, not consciously, but deliberately, to ensure that those people may be able to hold power over other people later in life. So that's how the system of domination gets passed on from one generation to another through a ruling class who are taught how to take power and keep power over other people. If we have our sense of empathy intact, we can't hold power over other people for very long. We start to feel for them. We start to see how horrible it is for them, and we won't do it. But if we've been deliberately had that cut off in the whole range of ways, being sent away to school when we're 7, being physically punished and drilled in a whole range of ways that happens at the kind of public schools that ruling class kids most often get sent to, it can become very hard to maintain our empathy. But this also shows up in our social structures. So for the rest of us who've just had ordinary upbringings with our share of trauma, in the different ways that happens to each and every one of us, we often still find that we deal with power in unhealthy ways. So really, typically, people will tend to either want to take power over other people, and they might do that by talking a lot in group situations. They might do that by taking a lot of physical space, or they give their power away. And we can give our power away in all kinds of different ways, but there's still that relationship with our own power, our own ability to be in our agency is damaged because we're living in a system of domination. And one of the things that the system of domination does is it stratifies people. So we have our upper class, ruling class people who are given a lot of privilege and who are often seen, in the UK, they're quite venerated. It took a long time for me to unpick the kind of very unconscious programming that the aristocracy was somehow, there was something special about them. That's because they've put a lot of work in over many, many centuries to suggest that there's something special about them. And different people, different types of people will get privileged in different ways. So often people in our culture, people who are white get privileged. People who are men get privileged. People who are middle class will get privileged over people who are working class. People who are able-bodied will get privileged over people who have some kind of less abilities. And one of the things that tends to happen when we're privileged is that we don't notice it. Nobody ever talks about it. So it all happens by inference, in the kind of collective, in the cultural unconscious. So that reflects our kind of personal unconscious. This is also a cultural unconscious that exists between us and in our structures and systems, almost always completely unquestioned because it's unconscious. And we can start to understand those privileges by listening to other people's experience. And that's where the kind of sense of that we could do our politics in a different way starts to come in. So we've been looking at assemblies as a way that tends to happen in Indigenous communities. This tends to be a kind of normal way for people to make decisions, is that they'll bring everyone together. And if we're going to do that here, there's a lot of pre-work that needs to be done, because most people have opted themselves out of decision making. We think that this is something that happens with just a few people in the House of Commons or in Holyrood, and that nobody else really needs to be involved in that, or in our local authorities, I guess, as well. So we need to do a lot of pre-work to engage with people who have opted themselves out, who think that their voices aren't worth listening to, or that maybe they don't think that, but they think they certainly won't be listened to if they were to be part of a process, because that's been their long experience. And those relationships need to be built before we even start to get into the room together. And this is something that we're working on in Scotland. We're looking at how do we start to convene assemblies that are properly inclusive, that properly give space for everybody who wants to be there to talk and think together. And a lot of this is built on the looking at what happens in citizens' assemblies. So citizens' assemblies and people's assemblies are slightly different in the way that they're put together. But basically, they're a way of bringing groups of people together in a facilitated process to talk and listen, to hear evidence from people who have got experience about particular issues, and then to talk with one another and think, well, what's the best thing to do here? And it's this idea of the wisdom of crowds, which is starting to be researched quite a lot. There's some interesting statistics around crowds being much more accurate than experts on the whole, and much more reliably accurate than experts on kind of simple issues like the weight of a cow. If you ask an expert farmer to guess the weight of a cow, they'll probably get it quite right, but they won't get it as right as a crowd every single time will. And this idea that diverse voices will bring lots of different opinions and different ways of looking at the world together. And if we can find ways to facilitate those conversations, we can end up with some really good decision making. And that's something that we're not used to seeing. The issue of facilitation feels like it's really important. It tends not to happen in Indigenous communities, and I think that's because people have grown up expecting to be part of assemblies, whereas here we really don't, so we need help with that. And we're looking at how to facilitate people's assemblies processes with an awareness of trauma. And that's to do with, just that kind of making a little bit of space for self-reflexivity, for what happens to me when I hear something that I don't like. So to start bringing in little strands of that which don't feel too challenging, but which are pointing at the fact that we've got choices around our reactions. We've had ideas about getting people to check in, being reflective on how much time they tend to take speaking in groups. So am I someone who tends to talk a lot, or am I someone who tends to step back? And what's a nice way to remind me if I speak a lot that I'm taking rather a lot of time? So people can start to facilitate one another. And then creating moments of kind of low intensity mindfulness, so that people aren't taken into places that feel uncomfortable for them, but they're not being rushed headlong through processes and never given a space of quietness to just have a think about where they're at and what they want to do next. Beg your pardon. So we're looking really here in this Reworlding week, and ongoingly, this is just a very first taste and step on a process, but we are serious question for all of us is, how could we do politics really differently? What would a system look like? Not just a change of faces, a change of colours in Parliament, but actually as a really different way for us to make our collective decisions. So maybe we work out how to have assemblies in our communities, and then we work out how to connect as communities Maybe we could even go to the global level as a world of communities, where we understand that the places that we live and we look after are where our life really happens, and that the global level is, to some extent, a bit of an illusion, and yet at the moment one that has a lot of power over our lives to take decisions that can either completely destroy our lives and the basis for our survival, our ecosystems, or that could turn that round. And I think one of is that that's be with 5 minutes. Thank you. I'm actually nearly finished. I think one of the really core issues in that is around trust. Given the history of colonization, given the fact that we people from Europe have gone out and smashed in other countries and other cultures, how can we build trust? And I think that is going to be a difficult process, and yet it's one that has to happen. For me, this is about changing our politics, but much more it's about healing or recovering from domination and colonization. And really that needs to happen in every sphere of life, from our closest relationships and even with ourselves, to our most public relationships, including our politics and our health system, our agriculture, our education. We need to begin from ourselves and work outwards with an energy and focus as though our lives depended on it, because actually they do. We've got to a point where we don't have many options, and it feels like this is an option that we do have. And if we put that kind of level of energy and focus, it could be something that could happen quite quickly. So it's really essential that those of us who have incorporated elements of domination, whether of ourselves or other people, into our unconscious, dig into understanding and healing that, and into the unconscious of our cultures and our processes and our systems that run unquestioned. And I think what we will find, as we do find, whenever we start to uncover these painful, difficult parts that compromise us, when we start to heal those, we have more access to joy, delight, creativity, and relationship. And this crisis, there are these multiple crises that we're facing, are actually a golden opportunity to come back to ourselves and to start from where we would prefer to start from. That's me.
Thank you. Inviting one of those pauses that Eva was talking about. Just sensing that possibility rippling through my body. Thank you, Eva. Yeah. I come from a scientific background. I spent possibly still most of my life playing with numbers and measuring things. And so I am deeply immersed, or at least I see myself like one of those candles, a deep in candle that you just add more and more layers of wax. And a lot of those layers for me are of that linear world that right now in my life, I find it has led to one of those processes of trauma that Eva was talking about, not of an event that was deeply traumatizing, but more of an erosive, long, ongoing, traumatizing oppression, basically, where I had to let go of a lot of what I feel is the essence of me in order to conform to a system. And yet there's something that I always ask myself recently is about the how. So how do we bring our traumas into the consciousness in a way that is safe, in a way that can be part of an assembly. And I'm really delighted to see that there's more and more. It's like it's like a wave that is catching on, and there's so much more research being done right now on trauma, on collective trauma, on how do we do this massive holding of things that are really deep and at the same time individual and social. So I've been doing that for my own process, and more in trying to bring that to the communities or the social projects that I'm involved with. And one of the things that have worked for me very much is about my own body. And there's also really deep and for me very beautiful research about how trauma affects not only our nervous system, and possibly there I need to go on a small tangent, which I guess most of you know, that the nervous system is actually so much part of our whole body. We know, again, more and more science is catching up with our own bodies, and we know more that it's not as centralized and head center as we always were told, or always our modern science had told us. So as you can imagine, trauma doesn't stay in our brain. It just goes really everywhere. And a lot of the chronic diseases, pain, postures, things that don't work very well are often the effects of trauma that has been somatized and is stored in our body. So even when we go through years of talking about it, analyzing it, and bringing the traumatizing events to our consciousness, the trauma may still be in our bodies. So, and this is not the truth. This is something that works in my particular case. It works for some people, and that diversity has been also very key for me to always bring awareness that whatever you hear, whatever you listen to here, it's just an invitation. It's just a possibility. And that I really invite everyone to give some time and thought for what works for you. So with that in mind, and we have organized this week with some sessions that we hope are going to be nourishing, but also quite challenging. So we are going to explore things that have to do with oppression, with race, with trauma, with how dispossessed we are, and things that are very joyful, like how do we come together, how do we build trust. And sometimes those resources, actually, for me, they have been really triggering, because I don't have those social structures that I hear about or that I talk to people about, and that can create a really deep grief as well. So even in our joy and in the positive, I really invite that we find ways of resourcing ourselves. So for the next minute, I would love to not speak, but allow everyone to just feel, inquire within yourself, what is resourcing me these days? It could be a practice, a place, a person, some food, anything. Just give it a thought. And again, this is something very personal. I think I find it very intimate to feel what's that. And sometimes it's also very useful to hear about somebody else's resources. So on a following email, we're going to share more of that. So I'm just going to share what has worked for me. And if there are many places in the world where community comes together to to hold those deep transformational processes. And I would like to read something that says, in shamanistic cultures, it is believed that when a person is traumatized, their soul leaves the body as a way to protect itself from intolerable pain. In a process known as soul retrieval, trusted community members surround the person with tremendous love and safety. In this sacred space, the soul is invited back so that the person can become whole again. And that's very much what we believe happens with trauma, that we become dissociated for our own safety. So the reactions to trauma are natural, and there's a lot of shame around them, which is one of the layers that sometimes prevents us from coming to it. So for me, one of the resources that I have discovered in the last 10 years or so is my own body. And the beauty of it, of the process that I was describing before, that a lot of the trauma gets stored in the body, is that we can use the body to relax a bit the contraction that we have about it. So one of the things that I find really powerful is the breath. And it's always there, almost always there. And it can be sometimes really challenging because we have an issue with the breath. So ignore that if that's the case for you. There are other places in your body that may be less affected. But if you feel comfortable with your breath, just explore how it is to just slow it down. The very simple act of really feeling the air coming in and flowing out. It helps me when I'm really agitated to actually count. And I find that when I can feel my heartbeat, I count 5 or 6 heartbeats in and the same out. Slowing the out breath is particularly calming. And a mixture of tensing and releasing. So tensing my body when I'm breathing in, and relaxing those parts that I can feel that are tense when I'm breathing out. Gives me the agency to actually relax. And there's always a gradient. There are parts of my body that I just keep on discovering, oh, that's also tense. And just being very gentle with that, because that's how it is in this moment. If I am in a group context asking for a pause, for me, it's part of the safety of the group. And I think that's part of our philosophy in Reworlding as well, that if people need to be, for it to be slower, or they need to take a break, that is welcome. And possibly my favorite thing to do, and something that I'm learning more and more, is part of many cultures, is to shake our body. And just, I'm sitting, so it's not so easy, but I just feel that I can really access different parts of my body that are stuck. And if I do it as a practice, it becomes easier to actually sit with it. And again, it's an invitation, and sometimes we have really a lot of pain that prevents that and makes it even more of a challenge. But sometimes just a small shaking, or even the image of a shaking, can be useful. And I'm not going to go through the whole list for the sake of time, but I'm going to share it with you. Using your hands is another amazing tool. And there's research showing that the body, if you actually hug yourself or touch particularly opposite sides of your body, so like your arms or the sides of your chest or your legs, crossing your arms, is particularly helpful because we are connecting the two sides. Apparently, to some degree, the body cannot tell that is you holding yourself. So there's a lot of receptors telling that you're being held. If you do that with kindness, it's a way of increasing the nervous system and the endocrine system release of safety hormones and substances. So we invite that as well. And the beauty of Zoom, I have discovered, is that it removes all the shame or cultural shame for doing this type of thing. So again, we invite you to do that with or without the video on. You will probably see me often just holding my heart or shaking or moving around. And I long for the time where these are practices that we can do in any of our meetings. I look back and I wish we could have done that in the very long and tedious and traumatizing to some degree meetings that I had for most of my life. So I think with that, I think I would like to move on to the next bit. And thank you.
Thank you, Dita. So we're going to, hang on, I just wanted to share a couple of links that I meant to share earlier. That's the article that I was referring to, and a resource that we've just started that may or may not be useful about the kind of deep decolonization that I was talking about. So we're going to go into breakout groups. And we have some seed questions that may be useful to for you to respond to. I think you can just take whichever one feels right to you, or something else that you want to talk about. We're going to put you in quite small groups and offer you the model of the way of counsel, which is a very, very simple process that we have used quite a lot in the lead up to this event. And it's a way just of passing space around a circle. But the important bit is how it's done. And so that when you're speaking, when it's your turn to speak, you're just speaking from the heart. You're not, you don't feel that you need to prepare anything or remember all the things that you wanted to say or respond to anything that anyone else has said. Just are encouraged to say whatever's coming out of your mouth. And then when you're listening, which you'll be doing more of the time, you're listening from your heart. You're listening with care and attention to this, and with as much lack of judgment as you can gather together to this other human being who's sharing where they are right now as honestly as they can. So it's a very kind process. It's a very kind way to speak and be spoken to, and to receive somebody else. And it often feels just really delightful. What reactions, either positive or negative, have you noticed in yourself in this session? And how does it feel to be asked? So that's one. Number two is, if personal and cultural healing are needed, but our culture makes us so afraid of approaching trauma, what are some ways we could approach that which don't scare people off or make them so reactive they can't engage? And the third one is, how do you notice cultural issues such as capitalism, white supremacy, domination showing up in you? And what are the antidotes that you are or would like to be working with just now?
Thank you for finding your way back. Apologies for those who had to have an extra long journey. And yeah, the corridors of Zoom. I hope that was a interesting, nourishing, or that it has something positive that you can take with you. And we would love to have the last 10 minutes or so of our meeting, just sharing, whoever wants to speak, either how you felt, if there was something particular of the whole session today that spoke to you either positively or negatively. How is it? And if any of you has experience in bringing trauma awareness or embodiment into your social work or into decision-making, politics, whatever, into your work life, we would also love to hear that. And just, we'll hear a couple and see how far we go. Thank you.
Bringing in that awareness of space and how long we take to speak.
Thank you.
It's okay. Just very briefly, I wanted to say, I feel it's very healing and health giving to come into spaces where all of us is welcome. There is an acknowledgement that when we're confronting our privilege, the power over within us and so on, the discomfort and the sense of, oh, I wish that wasn't a part of me, is as welcome as the parts of me that I'm more comfortable with. And I find that so healing and powerful, so thank you.
Thank you for putting that in such beautiful words.
Could I ask a question, Dita? The question I'd like to ask is maybe people's thoughts on like the difference between compassion and empathy, and you know, the way sometimes with trauma, and particularly like the way, you know, we are feeling, or some people are feeling about the catastrophes of the world, and they're so traumatized about what's happening that they almost they zone out because they just can't deal with it. And I think about that a lot. So I was wondering if there was any thoughts on that.
I think it's a really interesting distinction, and it's a difficult one to make between compassion and empathy. For me, empathy has a bit more kind of gutsiness, a bit more, I'm feeling what you're feeling. And it feels a bit more kind of human to human. I don't know whether it's my take on it, but I see compassion as a little bit superior to inferior. I feel compassion for you, you poor thing. I am okay, but you're clearly not. Whereas empathy is more like, oh God, yeah, I can feel that because I know suffering and you're suffering, and there's something a bit more kind of gutsy and real. But I don't know, I may just be trying to make that difference because I like empathy and have less of a connection personally with compassion. And I know also just a little bit on that kind of, you know, the overwhelm of the awfulness in the world. And it's something for me that I often just don't go, I just don't go there. I know that I care. But if I was to just let it in all the time, I would just be a little heap on the floor, and I wouldn't be able to do the work that I do. And I think that you know, where that kind of cutoff point comes is different for different people, and it works differently for different ones of us. But yeah, that's how I let it in sometimes, but I often just don't.
That's very interesting, Eva. I almost have I love that you said that about compassion. It just kind of shines a light to something that I feel. So something resonates and I kind of put my finger on it. What I wanted to mention is about the really big traumas that are happening all the time, traumatic events. And there's something I read recently from Thomas Hübel, who's working on that expansion of these tools at the collective level. And he was suggesting that we are in the process of transitioning from a trauma-produced society to a trauma-aware society. And the process from there to a healing of the trauma, it's still going to take a long time, which is really scary, given the pain that is there. And yet I sense that there is a deep truth in that we can't rush these things. So my hope and my wish is that we can do that at an individual level as much as we can. And in that, just kind of let things also grow and emerge and just make as many safe spaces as possible for people to be in, while stopping the things that are producing harm as much as we can.
So,
Hi, sorry, was someone else going to speak? Okay, so I work as a school counsellor in Scotland, and there's very much the conversations about adverse childhood experiences becoming part of the conversations. All the teachers and all the kind of the people working with children are being taught and far more aware of kind of what happened to a child that they are. So it's not, so it's, rather than going a child is seeking attention, is what is it they're actually needing right now. So there's kind of a lot of good work, and there's also recognizing how much, what is trauma, you know, rather than people go, oh, it's this horrific event. It's what Eva was saying earlier. It's any experience where we can't process it properly. So, and the thing about kind of recognizing where you need to support your own self in that, so you don't get lost in somebody else's kind of, I kind of don't recognize it till the end of the day, and then I need to eat. It's like, that's my kind of dealing with it. But yeah, I just want to put there is some work going on with the Scottish government, so there's some good stuff.
I'm just going to dive in. I've worked in all sorts of different capacity building communities and practices, and compassion practices are deep, and they don't necessarily mean ascendancy and I've been around codependency, and interdependency and codependency are really clear distinctions I will make, because I am an empath, and it took me a long time to understand that empaths actually are great codependents. And I am, a recovering empath. So I'm just going to say that as clearly as I can. So for me, when I am seemingly withholding, it is because I am taking the time within myself to integrate, step back, and it sometimes may look like I am not empathic, because I am taking the time I need to process or take in or find what response I can have in a situation. But that's taken years of learning how to be with me, and also how to be with others. So it's not just about me. So it's also how to be with others. And so there's been a real ongoing learning in that. So that's just my yada yada.
Thank you, Nancy. Yeah, honoring the time commitment that we have for today. I would love to invite Eva to say something to finish.
Stay away from institutions. Good bit of advice there for all of us to take off into our next whatever it is, and hope to see you again in other sessions. Thank you very, very much for coming. And yes, if you want to open up your mics and say goodbye in your own language or in any language you feel like, please.
Au revoir.
Thank you.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Everyone.
Auf Wiedersehen. Bye all.
Bye bye.
Cheerio.
Don't laugh.
Ciao.
Goeie nacht.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Ciao.
Maheri.
Ciao.
Buonanit. Yeah,
I think I'll just say